Hello, everyone, and welcome to Direction Sud, East Africa facing COVID-19. My name is Emma Harake, and I'll be moderating this discussion. So this conversation is part of our discussion series titled Direction Sud, Conscience non confinée, organized by Convergence des Luttes de Suds in collaboration with Alternatif. And these conversations attempt to highlight the risks as well as the consequences of the COVID-19 pandemic on various movements and struggles underway in the Global South. So with that being said, I would like to invite you to like and share the video and tag your friends. And if you wish to stay informed about or you don't want to miss the upcoming conferences or discussions, you could subscribe to our page as well. So today, after having addressed the situation in Latin America, the Maghreb, the Caribbean in face of this pandemic, our fourth conference will focus on East Africa, where we are pleased to have Duha Al-Mardi with us from Sudan, Abdirrahman Ahmed from Somalia, and John Kamanga from Kenya, whom I will be introducing next. So I'll walk you through how this conversation or discussion will be going before we start. So, to start, we will hear from our guests who will each share a short 5 minutes presentation about or giving us an overview of the situation in their country in the context of the pandemic. And afterwards, our speakers will take turn answering some questions that I have for them. And then I will share some of your questions. So if you wish to participate or if you have some questions to ask the speakers, please type your questions in the comments section below this live, and I will pose them in the second part of our discussion. And I think this is it for our introduction. So we will start now with Duha Al-Mardi. So I'll introduce Duha and then she'll start us off. So Duha is a Sudanese nonprofit professional with over 10 years of experience in community organizing and humanitarian work in Sudan, Malaysia, the US, and is currently based in Canada. She's an Atlas Corps Fellow and currently working as the Education and Engagement Coordinator at Sustainable Concordia, as well as a Monitoring and Data Officer with the Sudanese Archives, a collection of human rights, organizations, independent media, and engaged citizens working to monitor and curate visual documentation related to the Sudan's uprising and other historic events. So to start us off, Duha, it would be great if you could give us a global picture of the situation and crisis management of this pandemic in terms of political decisions and governmental approach in Sudan.
Sure. Thank you, Emma, for the introduction. Hi, everyone. So in terms of just a global overview of the situation in Sudan in regards to the pandemic, the first COVID-19 case in Sudan was reported on 13 March. And then following that was a series of government policies and basically announcing a public health state of emergency in the country. Which began with things like halting visa issuance for certain countries. We've got schools and universities closed. Khartoum International Airport stopped its commercial flights, and currently it's still being stopped until the May 31st. All land borders were closed. There was a ban on public transportation between cities and states. They also started with a 6 a.m. to 6 p.m. curfew. And then it became a 24-hour lockdown, which was effective from April 18, and is still happening. And the Ministry of Health has established isolation centers in Khartoum for suspected cases. So they've got the Khartoum Teaching Hospital, there's a Jabra Trauma Center, there's the Universal Hospital in Bahri in Khartoum North. And they also have the call center for the Ministry of Health that people can call into. There's been daily press briefings by the Ministry of Health to inform the public on the situation. And as of today, there's around almost 3,000 positive cases, confirmed cases in Sudan. There's 247 recovered, and there's around 113 deaths. So it's still an ongoing situation. The cases are mostly concentrated in the capital city, in Khartoum, but we have a lot of other cases also in other states like Jazeera, Al-Gadarif, North Kordofan, Sinnar, Kassala. So some other states are also having cases. The healthcare system in Sudan, of course, is still very fragile at the moment, given the whole context of the situation in Sudan with the past regime. So the healthcare system obviously can't handle a massive cases. There's currently less than 80 ventilators in the whole country. There's a scarcity of ICU beds. Some hospitals are facing shortages in medical and health personnel. Some health personnel had to be isolated as well, which caused an issue. There's been severe shortages in personal protection equipments as well. So that's kind of the general picture right now.
Thank you, Daha. I would say next, I will ask Abdirrahman Mohammed Ahmed to share with us, but before he does that, I'll read also a short biography. Né à Djibouti, Abdirrahman Ahmed est diplômé de HEC Montréal dans la gestion et le développement international. Abdirrahman Ahmed est le directeur adjoint de l'institution régionale de la Corne d'Afrique depuis 2011. Il a encouragé la coopération et l'échange d'informations et d'expériences entre les institutions gouvernementales des différents pays de la région et le milieu universitaire et centres de recherche pour renforcer les connaissances environnementales existantes dans la région. Après 5 années d'une riche expérience pratique et théorique, Abdirrahman vient de lancer la première entreprise sociale et environnementale à Djibouti dénommée Green Djibouti International, ayant pour vision d'initier des projets à caractère social et environnemental pour mobiliser la diaspora et la jeunesse de Djibouti vers les opportunités et de l'entrepreneuriat vert. So, Abdirrahman, it's really the same question, I would say, really giving us this global overview of the situation and crisis management of this pandemic in terms of political decisions and governmental approaches. Abdirrahman, yes.
Yes, thank you, Emma. Can you hear me? I would like first to thank the platform Convergence des Luttes de Suds, as well as Alternative. And yes, I will, maybe there was something missing on the introduction. Yes, I will discuss about Somalia case, but also I will discuss about Djibouti as well as Ethiopia. So this pandemic, the COVID-19 has been a total disaster when it comes to the global south. And at the same time, this pandemic is unmasking a lot when it comes to government or governance of the different country. Like my sister said, Duha, the whole health situation or the health system within the developing country was already weak, as well as the different institutions related with when it comes to the health system. And as you know, for example, when we're talking about Sudan, when we're talking about Ethiopia, Somalia, or Kenya, these countries are huge, huge, except Djibouti. Djibouti is actually the smallest country when it comes to the Horn countries. But these countries are huge, meaning that actually there are many different district localities, town, village, and most of the government actually, or the better service are only located within the capital city and the biggest cities. So when it comes, for example, let me start with Djibouti. Djibouti is actually the country who has now in relation with the population, it's less than 1 million, the population of Djibouti. It's the country that has the highest ratio when it comes to the people who has been diagnosed positive with COVID-19. As of yesterday, I didn't get today yet the latest released by the Minister of Health of Djibouti, but it was around 1,400 cases and 7 deaths. When it comes to Somalia, until yesterday, there has been approximately 500 cases, but the death rate is much higher. Somalia has reported death rates around 40 dates until now. When it comes to Ethiopia, the biggest problem in Ethiopia, I used to work, you mentioned there, and I used to live for almost 6 years there. It's actually to get reliable, verifiable information when it comes to the government of Ethiopia. They have a huge problem when it comes to communication. So until now, we're talking about 350, 400 cases of COVID-19 positive cases. But at the same time, Ethiopia is the country that has the highest population when it comes to the whole Horn region. We're talking about 120 million people in Ethiopia. In the case of Somalia, we're talking about 22 million.
أنا ما فتح الزوم.
The government didn't plan anything when it comes to energy or electricity. And maybe people doesn't know, but Djibouti is actually the country that is registering the highest living condition. So in the other countries, when it comes to Ethiopia, Somalia, they didn't actually implement a total lockdown, but Djibouti has implemented a total lockdown, and it created a huge problems.
Yes.
So I don't know if there was a cut.
Yes, at least from my end, there was a short cut. Okay. I think around a minute. The last thing I was hearing was when you were talking about how at Ethiopia there's, I would say, we cannot maybe trust the communication or the information being relayed, and talking about the population, it's 120 million over there. Okay. So, and then we lost you for a minute or two, and then around the end. So
just to what I was mentioning when I was cut was actually when it comes to Ethiopia, Djibouti, Somalia, the response, the governmental response when it comes to COVID-19 has been a total disaster. Part of it was actually their response was not up to the pandemic. Worst case has been Djibouti. Djibouti has been the country that actually implemented a total lockdown starting from mid-March, without any alternative plan for people to get any food to continue to live. So it created a huge social unrest in Djibouti, where people actually refused to obey, until actually today, where we can see within the people where people are talking about, oh, this is just a conspiracy from the government. We don't believe into the COVID-19, and the government actually is doing this just to punish us, and then actually to get to continue holding power of the country. When it comes to Ethiopia, the problem has been more political, because there has been a political interest the last couple of months, and the political interests are continuing. As you know, the young leader who's power now, Abiy Ahmed, is not an elected official, and although there has been a lot of freedom that has been guaranteed, now it looks like actually Ethiopia is going back again, where actually they discussing about actually trying to use the pandemic to not hold the election. And then all the political parties are refusing to play that game. Same thing when it comes to Somalia. Somalia case is totally different. Somalia actually is coming back after 30 years of civil wars. And for the first time, the last 2 years has been where for the first time Somalia has an official government where the international community actually recognized this government, and they don't have anything. The country is totally in debt. All the institution has been destroyed. Nothing is there. And then the pandemic happened. So you can imagine how the huge impact of this pandemic when it comes to this country. And then I would like to let my colleague, my brother Kamanga, continue with Kenya. Then maybe we can discuss what has been the answer or the response of the people, because the response of the people has been amazing when compared to the government. Thank you.
Thank you, Abdulrahman. And you know, there are lots of intersections between, or you elaborated more because you talked about more countries, about how, like something similar to what Doha was speaking about, how the health system is not, let's say, fit or able to accommodate this, this pandemic and the people suffering from it. But also, I think what you highlighted is really like this how the pandemic affects different countries and different regions and different country differently. And as you said, we will getting back to this later. So now, finally, to give us an overview of the situation and crisis management in Kenya, we have with us John Kamanga. I'll be introducing him as well, and then I'll let him start. So with a background training in anthropology and community development, John has worked with various communities across the country, especially in rural areas of Kenya, for over 15 years. Currently the director of the South Rift Association of Landowners, an affiliate organization of the African Conservation Center. In this capacity, his mandate is to work with pastoral communities to promote biodiversity conservation, the Maasai culture and tourism in the region between the Masai Mara and Amboseli, in order to enhance livelihood and better management of natural resources. John has also had first-hand grassroots leadership experience with different communities because of his efforts in community conservation. He was awarded the Cincinnati Zoo and Botanical Gardens Conservation Leadership Award in 2013. So, John, I think it's your turn now also to share with us an overview of the situation in Kenya. You're muted, so yeah.
Thank you very much, Emma, for this opportunity to share also from this side of the Horn of Africa, Kenya. Yeah, the situation is not very different as well from what my colleagues who went before me talked about. Today in Kenya, we have a total of 963 cases of COVID and about 50 deaths in the country, and about 358 people who have recovered. I think the country moved into full swing 2 months ago with the first case reported, where they closed, most of the international travels by air. There was a curfew from 7 to 5 in the morning across the country. They further then moved, because I think there has been progression over time, to close all the institutions of learning in the country, so that all the children, universities, tertiary institutions, all of them were closed. And then lately, they have ended up now even closing more some of the main towns in the country. So Nairobi, Mombasa, so most of the town, a couple of the towns that are the hubs of communication and center of business in the country have been closed, because the cases in those particular areas have really been increasing. So they have had to close entry to those areas as a way of containing the pandemic. But also, in addition to that, this was actually only last week this week, where the country have had to close a couple of international borders. So they have closed entry in and out of Tanzania, and closed also in and out of Somalia, which were seen to be some of the countries that were now with the international travel closed, which was the big cause of the pandemic for us. Those countries, the cases are high. The cases in Tanzania, the cases in Somalia are reported to be high, and because of the porous borders, the country has had to move into close those borders as well, which is creating a little bit of friction across the country. And of course, the country has moved to create a couple of laws that have allowed for people to ensure that you are wearing masks, and that is regulated. There are fines if you are not wearing when you are out in public. Making sure that they are controlling the number of passengers going into any of the public transport vehicles, so that then they can again minimize, keep social distances. Because of the thinking that because of the poverty levels and all that, one of the greatest areas of worry is that if the cases of COVID start to increase in certain parts of the country, and especially the slums areas, the arid areas of the country where there is a huge congestion or where the infrastructure is not right. So quarantine facilities were set aside immediately in the country, whether in the main centers, but even in the rural areas. Even some schools or learning institutions were then created as quarantine centers, so that then they can contain the building. So I think in terms of, but also beyond just controlling the disease, I think because of the economic impact that was seen to be then hitting the country, a couple of laws have also been created to ensure that people, in terms of taxation and all that, were able to get some relief. So that then the economy, doesn't crash. Of course, there are a lot of issues in terms of food and whether people are able to access the required safety equipment across the country, but also actually supplies into the country for testing and all that. Given that a lot of that material is coming from outside the country and mainly from China, where that is where things started, and yet we have to depend on them to actually get the material. So there are a couple of issues there. Do we actually trust the kits that we have from China? Is it so? Although the government is doing things rightly, but people are cautious about it and just worried that we might be falling into a trap that is set for us. But I think they have done a good job of handling it so far. Yeah.
Thank you, John, for this overview, and thank you, Duhan Abdirrahman. This has been, at least for me, really helpful, to get this overview. Our next question actually addresses, I think you've already talked about the measures being taken by different governmental officials or governments in these different countries. So the next question, maybe I'll ask Abdirrahman to start us, whether, you talked about lockdowns, curfews, I think you've also talked about the way the government also testing and the information. Anyway, so is the population really following the measures, set by the governments? And if not, were there repressions against them, or were repressive measures taken, especially in terms of laws, bylaws, regulations, etc.? If you could share a little bit with us.
Thank you, Emma. Yes, let me start with Djibouti. The government actually set up a committee headed by the Minister of Health. And then there is a constant, there is a daily briefing from the Minister of Health, as well a very good, let's say, sensibilization when it comes to an awareness raising, when it comes to the COVID-19, especially when it comes to social distancing, taking face mask, and actually, but the problem was this measure has been actually just half measured. The government actually just went for a lockdown without planning the daily life of the people. Let's talk, for example, if we talk about the situation in Djibouti, it's not like Kenya or Sudan, where you have a huge sector on agriculture, where you have a huge important people actually were farming their land. Djibouti actually import everything, so it's a service country, and within that you have more than 75% of the population who are gaining their daily life with informal economy. So when the government established a total lockdown, it actually hit the people very hard. What happened was actually when the people saw that actually the government was not actually doesn't care about their subsistence, they organized themselves. And for example, there has been, especially for Ramadan, there has been these young people who created a hashtag called like solidarity for Ramadan. And what they do is actually they collect food and then they target the poor neighborhood of Djibouti city. And then it has been very successful. It has been actually led by one of a young activist of Djibouti called Charlie. But at the same time, what's happening is actually the government is targeting and oppressing and arresting these young activists actually who are actually bringing creative solution to real problems faced by the people, and that the government actually is not listening to their population or nothing else. When it comes to Somalia, it's totally different. Somalia, it's mostly a pastoral nomadic society where livestock play a huge role. There, the government, as I said, has a huge weakness. All the institution has been destroyed, so they're trying to cope with that. So what's going on is actually in a lot of cities, when you go, for example, me, now I am in Somalia, I am in a small town. When the pandemic started, I couldn't have access to the face mask. So what we did was actually we created our own mask using socks, and then we just used that. And then when I went out, actually just going to the market, a lot of people were surprised. And then people were coming saying, "Hey, why are you wearing this mask? Are you infected?" So it's creating kind of a backlash, because here the information is actually not reaching the people because of a government who's actually coming out from 30 years of civil wars. When it comes to Djibouti, it's totally the opposite. People have the information, but the government, the Djibouti government, despite all the aid it received from international community, especially the case of Djibouti is really interesting, because Djibouti is where you have the biggest and the only military base, American military base in Djibouti. And you have also in the whole continent, the first and only Chinese military base, not mentioning the French, the Italian, German, Japanese, and other military base. So all these countries, actually what they did was actually they gave huge aid. What happened was total corruption. Most of the money disappeared. Most of the material that was received by Djibouti, actually, some of them we found it here in the black market in Somalia, where they were selling the face mask, the gun, and other things. Then you have the situation in Ethiopia. There also, what I mentioned was it's a huge country, 120 million, very poor country. There has been what's called actually a spring of freedom, but the actual prime minister is not an elected. And then there is a huge tension, political tension in different huge countries, be it in the Oromo area, be it in the Amhara area, or the Tigray area, or the Somali region of Ethiopia. There is a huge unrest. So this also is actually creating huge challenge when it comes for the government of Ethiopia. And I would like just to add the last comments that my brother Kamanga mentioned. The funny thing is actually when the pandemic started, the first help that this country in the Horn of Africa received was from Jack Ma, the Chinese billionaire. Not even from the Chinese government. The Chinese government, it was the second time, but the first help came from Jack Ma. And we know all that a billionaire, he can say whatever he can say, being a humanist or philanthropic, but there is always something behind. We know already the debt trap that this country already are facing when it comes to China. And the only country actually that's bringing material help is actually either the private sector of China, a communist country who has a private sector, or from the communist government from China. But The other problem is actually also this, what I said at the beginning, this pandemic is unmasking a lot of problems, a lot of governance problem when it comes to Africa and specifically Horn countries. How come this country never build their own health system? How come we cannot have just the testing capacity? For example, when it comes to Somalia and Djibouti, we are sending the testing material to Kenya to get the result and bringing back them. And you know, when they stop the airlines, it's creating a huge disaster in terms of logistics. But how come this country that has all the meanings and everything, how come they didn't build? How come they didn't build the research or the facilities? So it's bringing the question of dictatorship, it's bringing the question of corruption, it's bringing the question of actually very, very weak institution. All of this element has been unmasked by this pandemic. Thank you.
Thank you, John. And I really believe, like the expression you're using, you know, unmasking, like the corruption or the things that governments choose not to see because it's not convenient at a certain time, how this pandemic is really unmasking and bringing everything to the forefront. So maybe let's go with John now. Maybe if you could share with us, John, I know you also spoke a bit about, you know, the situation in Kenya and the kinds of laws being enforced by the government. So maybe if you could, like you spoke about how, you know, the lockdown, curfew, and you said that it's creating some friction around the country. So like, let's hear more about that, how the population is taking these measures, following them, and like if there are repressions against population. So what kind of repressive measures are being taken, you know, in terms of laws and regulations?
I think, like, you know, many African countries, Kenya, because of the many years of some bad laws, you know, people normally when laws are passed, people are not really, they don't really take it seriously initially. So there was a curfew, and people were supposed to be home by 7 in the evening. But, you know, was it real? Is it something that, you know, could happen or not? And for the first week, it was hell, because a lot of people were still trying to close business. A lot of them, you know, your boss at work is releasing you maybe at around 6 o'clock or 5 o'clock. But by the time you've gotten into public transport all the way to your home, you are late, and therefore by the time you are late and you find askaris, a lot of people were battered badly. Actually, there was quite a bit of circulation of people being you know, bashed by policemen, military, and all that. Of course, some people also, you know, just, you know, did not want to follow law initially, and they were in pubs, in drinking places, and they were found, you know, by the time that of lockdown, of the curfew. So there was quite a little bit of that in the first week, and then, you know, it stabilized a little bit. But of course, when it continued for beyond a month, now you see people starting to really get a little angry, because then what happens, you know, the evenings, so if you close business by 5, the evening when everybody is leaving work, for a lot of people who are running little businesses, that is when everybody is buying. But now you realize that you can't sell your wares to the, you know, people, because you know that is the time that you are supposed to be home. So that really destabilized people a lot. And in different parts of the country, people, you know, weren't really happy with the laws. And a lot of the time, again, there are areas where, you know, people are opening up, other areas people are not open. So the hotel industry was really badly affected, and, you know, closing. So even people accessing food was a very difficult thing, because there was no hotel that was supposed to sell food, and therefore people were buying food and, you know, eating in the streets as they were walking, because there were no seats in hotels. Were allowed to sell food, but you can only sell food if it is on takeaway basis. If it is for eating, then you can't be able to sell. So a lot of them had to shut down. Of course, that means that people, when they are going to work, they will not be able to access, you know, food during the day. So of course that also could impact badly on the productivity of the population. So that was those have been part of the things that people have been revolting against. Of course, one of the big thing even today people are still talking about is this education, because most of the kids now are home with their parents for a period of 2, now going to close to 3 months, and without proper systems, and of course with a lot of poverty and people not. So some schools are able to offer online courses, but a lot of them, because they're living in rural areas, there's no electricity, there's no internet, they cannot be able to access that. So you have kids at home for about 3 months without a proper tuition going on, and that will affect their performance and could actually affect that whole generation in life, because they're looking at doing their exams at the end of this year, and with a 2-gap period, and we still don't know what's going to happen. That is really going to affect the ability to move on to the next institutions. So yeah, and of course you have a lot of those kids in homes, parents not being able to provide appropriately, and all that. So it's a little messy. There was economies were destabilized. People are not able to provide. Actually, in the rural areas, part of the suffering is because a lot of the rural areas are people who you have pastoral communities that are dependent on livestock for their livelihood, and tourism in certain areas where they have wildlife. So those are the main 2 sources of livelihood. Now tourism was stopped because then there is no international travel, and then today a lot of the livestock markets have been closed. So with no tourism and no livestock markets open for those rural communities, what are they supposed to eat? And the government is not providing relief for them. That has not come through yet. So there's quite a little bit of suffering of people. Of course, in places like Nairobi, we have issues of robberies now increasing, because people, if they are sitting at home, they can't eat, and yet they see others with food, then they will go in and with guns and be able to get food for themselves.
Thank you, John. And I really believe it's really, like what you're saying really echoes some of the things that Abdirrahman talked about, how like the government went to total lockdown without much planning ahead on how to sustain the population. So yeah, maybe like to end on this question or reflection, maybe Duha, you could share like the perspective from Sudan. Do you want me to repeat the question, or are you?
No, I got it.
Yeah.
Thank you, Emma. So I think it's almost pretty much the same as what Abdirrahman said and what John said. Sudan is, like many other countries in Africa, is a very like socially knit country. People are really, people know each other, and society and social things really play a big impact on people's daily lives. So this has been really hard because people, and especially now with the month of Ramadan where this is a big social month where people fast together in the streets and the neighborhoods. So it's very hard to kind of make sure that people are all staying in at the same time. It's really difficult. They did a lockdown, of course, 24-hour lockdown. There's mosques and churches have been closed, and of course public gatherings are not allowed. But at the same time, people are still going out. Unfortunately, not many people are completely locked down in their homes. Like what Abdirrahman mentioned earlier, there are still some people who are thinking that this might be a conspiracy theory, that they don't believe that it's real. So that's been a little bit hard. There's been a lot of awareness on a very local level, but it's still kind of a little bit centralized. It's not as decentralized as it could be. And about repressive measures, yes, there have been repressive measures, and that's very natural, seeing that at the beginning of this pandemic, there were hundreds of members of the Sudan Armed Forces, of the Rapid Support Forces, the Janjaweed militia, that is the militia of Hemeti. They were deployed throughout the country to enforce measures. So obviously, when you have hundreds of members of this militia and armed forces, there will be repression. So we have seen some, just recently, actually, I think three days ago in Khartoum, in the neighborhood of Abu Hamama in Khartoum, a member of Sudan Armed Forces shot and killed 2 people on Saturday evening because of the lockdown, because they were out after the lockdown hours, and they both died. And we're seeing, for example, in El Gadarif, there was an activist who was detained when he was actually doing an awareness campaign explaining the dangers of the coronavirus pandemic to a group of other people. And there's obviously also a lot of fines that are imposed on people violating the measures. And given the economic situation of the country, a lot of people can't afford these fines that they're being charged. And actually more localities across the country are right now starting to impose more fines. Which doesn't make any sense given the situation, the economy in Sudan. No one can afford to pay these fines. A lot of people are also, not only that they don't believe in the virus, but a lot of them also really they depend on daily income. So they need to go out to feed their children. And a lot of people would be out weighing whether my chances of falling ill or not eating at all. They would take the chance of falling ill just to be able to provide food for their children. So unfortunately, that's the situation. And it's, with repression, as I said, as long as you have military and you have militias who are armed in the streets, there will be repression.
Thank you, Daha. And thank you for all the speakers, really, for sharing your thoughts. I think the second question I think all 3 of you have touched on how the pandemic has affected different regions differently and different people differently, So I would say the next question, maybe I'll start with John. Which parts of the population are the most impacted by COVID-19 in terms of infections by the virus and subsequent death? And I think you've already also touched on that. What is the economic impact for marginalized people? How are authorities behaving towards these people in this context? So are there actually specific measures being taken to support and look after the most vulnerable?
Thank you. So I will think that in terms of the vulnerable in Kenya, I think there are two groups mainly, and so that is the urban poor, who really are keeping the industries going, and with that population, because of the curfew, the working hours are shrinking, and the industries in terms of productivity have been affected, and so a lot of the industries have had to close or cut down on labor, and therefore people have to go back home. So you're either working on half or a quarter of your normal salary that you work, and it's like a daily piece of work. And now if you only have to work for half a day, you're hardly, and that is a population that was already anyway hardly earning $1 a day. You can imagine what is happening to that population. And then the second population that is affected a lot, again, I said the communities in the rural areas, because already anyway infrastructure was poor, and therefore you did not have hospitals that are able to support these kind of cases, and therefore anybody who is sick has to come all the way to Nairobi or other main centers. But you can imagine traveling in already an area where the infrastructure is not there. So you could take days before you ever actually are brought to centers of treatment. And of course, I mentioned that in the rural areas, the main production system, you're looking at normally tourism, and you're also looking at livestock production. Tourism is not happening. Livestock markets are closed. So really, with those populations, it's a matter of time. But it will be a big disaster, because people will now want relief to be supported. Unfortunately, even for some of the population then in the rural areas, we have had other tragedies that have happened, because at the end of last year, it was a big drought. So therefore, people were already distressed because there was no food and the animals were weak. And then the rains begin, and with the rains came the locust. Okay, And as the country was trying to fight the locust pandemic, then COVID comes in. Now, there's not a lot that is happening. The locusts are still there in parts of the country, but the focus at the moment of the whole country is now COVID, forgetting that those populations were already stressed because of the pasture, the little food that they had was already being destroyed by the locusts, and then there's a shift to this health disease. So those populations will continue to suffer because they don't have access. We are only hoping that, and some of them, just because they are very social in nature, they have a lot of cultural activities that are going on, and there isn't sufficient awareness, on that, or to try and block that. So some of them are still happening, and that is a disaster, because you only need 1 or 2 cases in such social setups that it goes up like a bushfire. So that is the situation that we are looking at in Kenya.
Thank you, John, for highlighting what's happening with the rural populations in Kenya. Maybe I'll ask Doha to respond next to the question about, which parts of the population are most impacted, and the economic impact. So yeah.
Yeah, so there's a large part of the population that's impacted by this, different parts of the population. Of course, again, like as mentioned earlier, this pandemic has, if we needed ever any proof of class privileges and the luxury that some people have while others are not having, 1% of that, this would be a very big evidence. And yeah, not a lot of people can stay at home in Sudan. This is obviously a very big class. There's a very big class divide. The measures impacted a lot of people and still are impacting a lot of people every day. First of all, there's still some security issues that are happening right now. We've seen recently incidents of clashes in Kadugli in South Kordofan. There's been tribal clashes in South Darfur. There's been continuous tribal clashes in Kasala between the Nuba and the Bani Amir tribesmen. And this specifically caused hundreds of families to flee seeking shelter during the pandemic. They're fleeing their homes for safety. And some of them are ended up staying in schools and in garrisons and in areas that are just very difficult to have shelter in a time like this. And they're all confined in one places. We've seen violence that continues to happen in central Darfur, in Nirtati, which also caused a lot of protest by people. And we've, in most of these situations, we've seen the RSF, the Rapid Support Forces, continue to be deployed to handle these clashes. So again, more repressive measures. There's been a situation at the beginning of the pandemic with dorms, with a lot of out-of-state university students. So a lot of dorms were suddenly shut down and emptied, and there was a ban on interstate travel. So this kind of prevented a lot of people from going to their homes, and some of them ended up becoming homeless. And until now, some of them are not able to leave to their homes. There are obviously a lot of businesses have shut down, as what John was saying. So this left many workers with no job. Save the Children Sudan actually wrote a few days ago about the situation of migrant workers, migrant women and men in Sudan. They said that about 50,000 migrant women and men who work as roadside tea sellers and restaurant attendants, they have lost their jobs, and that this could potentially lead to 500,000 migrants in Sudan not being able to have food and water. We have like a lot of people who sell in the market, as I said earlier, and they rely on daily wages, daily income. They have lost their income. There's asylum seekers in refugee camps in the east part of Sudan that are all confined in terrible situations. There's prisoners, of course. There's no measures whatsoever for any of these populations by the government. There's shortages of water and cooking gas in almost all the states in Sudan. So people, even when they can go out at a certain time, they would still end up in lines of waiting for cooking gas and things like that. There's also another issue with the medical, and I spoke about this briefly earlier, but the medical situation is also still very dire. There are nurses and health professionals who are who have contacted the virus because there is no PPEs. There's a very big shortage in protection, personal protection equipment. There's 25 nurses who have contacted the virus, and about 300 nurses were countrywide are quarantined right now. And even those who could stay at home, the comfort of staying at home itself is a privilege. You can, just because you're locked in a certain area does not mean that you're safe. There's the rates of domestic violence, for example, are very high. There is a very big disconnect in that, in terms of what the country is providing to make sure that people are safe, that women are safe in their houses. When it comes to domestic violence, there's been a hotline that they have released recently, but it's still kind of a new thing. So that's definitely increasing during this pandemic. There's also situations with women in camps in terms of sexual assaults. And this is obviously before the pandemic, but now a lot of people they cannot escape. They're in one area with their abusers. And this is the case with women in camps in different parts of Sudan. In terms of economic things, there's been a new salary structure that was released recently in Sudan. And I think that it's going to be applied, I think, starting from June, if I'm not sure, or the next payroll. But there's been a big increase in wages recently for public workers and teachers and police officers and so on. But that's only limited to those people who are working in these professions. So again, anybody who's not within this profession, they're not included in this salary increase or wage increase. For example, the situation with cleaners, hygiene vehicle drivers in Khartoum. They held a strike very recently, just last week, to demand inclusion in the new salary structure and also demanding safe work equipment, which they don't have. Some of these workers have been working for 20 years, and the administration still kind of describes them as temporary. So denying them healthcare, denying them social security, denying them end of service benefits. And that's mainly because the hygiene committee or the hygiene association was privatized to companies instead of being public. So now a lot of these people are not covered within these salary structures. So yeah, that's pretty, as far as I know, that's pretty much the situation.
Thank you, Daha, as well. It really doesn't take long to see how people who already experience systematic inequality, poverty, discrimination are the ones most impacted by the pandemic. So now I'll ask maybe Abdulrahman to share with us which parts of the population are the most impacted by COVID-19 in Djibouti, Somalia, and Ethiopia, and the economic impact and how the authorities are behaving towards the people.
Thank you. Thank you, Emma. We can say, for example, when we look, let me start with Djibouti. When we look Djibouti, the economy is based on service, and the huge part of population are working in what's called informal economy. We call it in local language sharshari, meaning, for example, women who are mothers who are taking care of the family and their kids, who are actually selling small shop, but still totally informal. And the majority of population actually are working on that. The second biggest part of the economy is actually public service, health, education, security apparatus, and all that. And then you have like a small private sector, but it's actually trying to become important, but it's not huge. It comes in third place. So majority of the people has been impacted because with the lockdown, people cannot go to work, and people who used to live or earn their small wage through informal economy cannot go out because the whole city has been controlled. That you have different checkpoints. You cannot move in the city because the army as well as the police are actually, they put in different parts of major road checkpoints. So what we saw also is at the beginning of this
Abdurrahman, we lost the audio.
But when they go, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, Abdurrahman. Can you hear us?
Yes.
Yeah. Go on.
So what I was saying is actually the health workers in Djibouti, actually, when they ask actually, because of the risk of being on the front line battle, when they ask actually to have their salary, because they were receiving their salary with 6 month delays. A lot of them at the beginning were taken by the police and put in prison. We're talking about the nurse and the health worker who are on the front line. And then you have also the situation in Djibouti, which is actually interesting because when you have like, there is no freedom of press in Djibouti. But then you have like a lot of people journalists and activists who trying to at least talk about the dramatic situation of where people are living. And every time we see these kind of things, immediately they are arrested and put in prison. The last case actually happened a week ago. A young journalist called Sharmake has been arrested because he just went into his neighborhood because there has been a fire and the fireworks didn't come. So there has been a lot of house that has been destroyed. And then the government didn't come to help or provide any help for the people. And when this young guy tried to report that situation, he was arrested on spot by the police, and he was put in the general prison in Djibouti, where now his life is in risk. So, and you have many other journalists who are in prison also. So I would like also to mention the particular situation of Djibouti with these huge foreign military bases. I mentioned the American, the Chinese, the French, the German, Spanish, the Italian, the Japanese. The first case of Djibouti of COVID-19 was by a Spanish soldier in March 14. And then the people who brought actually this pandemic was when Europe was actually getting the pandemic, and then a lot of people from Djibouti were coming back, and the government didn't stop. Okay, fine, people were returning back to their country, but they didn't put also any health measure at the airport to scan and then to try to see who are the people who might have the COVID-19 or not. They didn't do it. That's how it started. And now we have like the highest ratio of people infected in Djibouti. Then 2 days ago, the government actually, with the social pressure mounting, decided to put a lock-up, actually to take up a partial lock-up. So now people can go out from 7 in the morning to 6 p.m. As my sister Duha mentioned, we are in the month of Ramadan. And you know, in the Ramadan, the whole cycle of working and social activity change. Usually people are fasting in the morning and they try to do their business or try to buy stuff after the end of the fasting, which is around 6 p.m. But now, no, there is a curfew starting at 6 p.m. in Djibouti. Also, the other thing that I didn't mention, the government, without consulting the parliament or the people, decided to make a cut of 20% of the salary of the people working at the public sector. That's also created or added to the frustration. Without actually providing also any help, because as I said, the living conditions in Djibouti are the highest among the African continent. So when you get your energy bill at the end of the month, it can represent 65% to 70% of your salary. And the government is not actually giving any relief or even delays to this. So today what we are facing, people had so much enough of all this oppression, so they started, the only way they can start is through Facebook and Twitter, a huge campaign to ask and say to the government, we cannot live, there is no life left to us, so please reduce the energy bill, not mentioning the water and unmentioned thing. If I talk about, let's say Somalia is a society totally destroyed by civil war, now coming back. Most of the population are pastoralists. So most of these people didn't get any information about the COVID. And the people who get the information, they don't have the means to protect themselves or even to get. If I mention the health sector, there is no health sector institution in Somalia right now. Only private clinic or private hospital that was built by some of the diaspora people. And what we are facing now, it's a huge rise in the price, be it at the food or at the medical bills or any other things. So huge inflation going on now in Somalia. If I mention a couple of elements about Ethiopia, you have the capital, and then you have the rest of the country, a huge country, mostly agricultural. So the government, what they did was actually, the first thing they did was actually to reduce or restrict the mobility of the people. And these people, is actually their life depend on it. So when they do something here, they try to go to another village or another town to sell their product, but the government is actually restricting through military. So that's why a lot of people are saying, no, the government is not doing this for the COVID pandemic, but there is also a political aspect behind it, because a lot of people or analysts are saying that if Abiy, the actual prime minister, the Nobel Prize, face an election, he will lose the election. So what now is going on in Ethiopia? You have like the pandemic as well as the political situation that's overlapping each other. But then you have also when it comes to the capital, where you have the African Union headquarters, meaning that you have a lot of people coming from Africa who are stationed there. You have also in Addis the highest number of embassies in all the African continent, meaning a huge number of foreign who are going out and coming and going out, because Addis Ababa airport is the major hub in the African continent. And that's why you have also a lot of people accusing Ethiopian Airlines, the main carriers, some people even call it the African continent carriers, of actually being part of the propagation of the COVID-19. Because until today, Ethiopian Airlines didn't stop their flight from China or to other countries. The only carriers that actually go. Yes, it's bringing a huge relief for countries like Djibouti or Somalia, because it was Ethiopian Airlines that brought the first relief or aid donated by China or donated by other countries. But at the same time, some people are accusing Ethiopian Airlines of not having been enough responsible, of enough professional to oversee the possibility of actually being one of the actors actually of the propagation of the COVID. If I can conclude on this, I can say that it's actually the majority of the people of these three countries have been impacted by a way or another by this pandemic. The only people who today are safe, if you can say, from this pandemic are the ruling class and their security apparatus. Let's say maybe the 1% or a little more than that are the only people. So some people are actually trying to make some jokes about this crisis and saying at least they cannot travel like they used to travel before. Because what we used to see before was every time that we used to have an African leader who gets sick, he used to travel because they don't trust their own health institution or health facilities. They used to go to Europe or they used to go to North America to get some medical help. Today, they cannot get that. But what they are doing, they put in place a huge security apparatus to protect from themselves, from their own population. At the same time, without thinking or coming with alternative plan or well-thought plan on how to actually bring relief or any solution to their own population. Even worse, when the people try to organize themselves, they try to oppress them and arrest the activists as well as the journalists or the health workers.
Thank you, Abdirrahman, for speaking about the realities, of these three countries. And I think you touched also upon, it's like I feel a good segue to the next question, you spoke about this political aspect and political unrest, I would say. So maybe I'll ask Duha to respond to the next question. So just a reminder for the listeners, before the pandemic, many social movements were fighting against those in power. What were their demands before the pandemic, and how are these demands made today despite the pandemic? And maybe if we could, like thinking about social movements, also thinking about, I would say, when you were speaking, you spoke about a lot about the infrastructures, I would say, and yeah, so if you could address that, Duha.
Sure. So as you know, Sudan has had the revolution very recently, and so the revolution in Sudan is, unfortunately, it's not over yet. So ever since that sort of transitional government took over with the civilian and the military together, there has been unrest that are still continuing. Protests have not stopped till right before the pandemic. We've had ongoing protests calling for justice for the martyrs of the revolution, calling for justice for lives that were lost during the 30 years of al-Bashir's regime. There's been a lot of bloodshed in these years, and there hasn't been proper investigations for things that have happened in the past. So people were, always protesting, calling for justice for all these previous things and serious investigations for all those things. For security, there's been a lot of protests for peace. Peace negotiations are still happening right now in Juba. They still haven't reached anything. People have mostly also been protesting for the economic situation. As I said, the economic situation continued to be very, very difficult. People were in lines for hours and hours for very basic things like bread, which is, when I say bread, I know it does, sometimes people may think, oh, they can just eat another thing. But in Sudan, bread is like the main staple kind of item. So these things have been ongoing. There's protests for the appointment of civilian state governors, which is taking very, very long, and people have been protesting continuously. So people have been protesting to make sure that the demands of the revolution are met. So this was ongoing right before the pandemic. And in terms of how the demands are met, so many demands have not been met yet, but that's also, of course, due to many reasons. First of all, due to it's only been a very short period of time since this government had taken over. So obviously time factor here is very important. But second of all, the nature of the agreement itself between the military and the civilians, it still comes in question of basically that there seems to be an imbalance of power here. Between who really holds the real power of executing stuff in the country and who doesn't. So that's been a big thing. But there has been some improvements. There has been some demands that are being, for example, the anti-corruption committee in Sudan has been done. They've been doing noticeably, probably the best work in terms of all the other committees, with seizing various properties of the previous regime, the NCP regime, their properties in the country, outside the country. There's, again, like with the whole salary wage increase, that's also an up. But other than that, I think everything else is still ongoing. And people right now mostly are just trying to navigate through this new reality of this pandemic. And as we said, the inequalities that this has showed in terms of access to food, access to shelter, safe shelter, and things like that. Yeah.
Thank you, Duha. Maybe I'll pass it now to Abdirrahman. If also you could share with us, I mean, I know it will be different between Djibouti, Somalia, and Ethiopia, but also, thinking about social movements who are fighting against those in power. So what were the demands before the pandemic, and how are these demands being met today in these three different realities, I would say?
Thank you. Emma. So let me start with Ethiopia. Ethiopia also actually faced an amazing popular revolution led by the most oppressed group of people within Ethiopia, the Oromo people. When you look at the social fabric in Ethiopia, the Oromo represent one of the, I think, the largest ethnic group within Ethiopia. At the same time, there has been the most oppressed because they were not within the government or not into any decision making. So when a peaceful revolution started within Ethiopia, it was led by the Oromo, especially by the youth, and then change happened at the head of the government, and that's why actually the actual prime minister came to power, although he's not elected. So today, the biggest problem facing Ethiopia is actually if Ethiopia will continue onto within the path of actually respecting all the freedom, and then having an election that will set up, and then but the good thing is actually with what happened with this revolution, it actually empowered the people, all the other different communities who were living together in Ethiopia, and then people are now asking a lot of revendication, be it at the labor level, be it at the environmental level, be it at the social level, be it just human rights, especially when it comes to women, because yes, Ethiopia it's a patriarchal society, and women actually are fighting for their right today. Youth also, different marginalized groups. All this today is jeopardized by this pandemic COVID. If I come to Somalia, as I said, Somalia was within a civil war, and until up to 2 years ago, the government was not recognized. It was a, how to say, it was kind of like not officially recognized, but since 2 years, the government is officially the government of Somalia. So Somalia today is officially back within the international community. That doesn't mean actually a lot of the problem have been solved. No, not at all. Actually, there are huge problems going on because the fact that there was not a central government, the beneficial effect it had was actually it left the social movement to organize themselves. So while there was not a central government, social movement was the people who actually was taking care of everything when it comes to Somalia. And women were actually on the front line. They were actually the one who are doing healthcare. They were the one who actually were in line when it comes to solidarity. They were actually the one actually bringing the men to stop fighting and disarm, and then come to peace agreement in different regions of Somalia. So now that you have a government that is coming back, then the whole situation was, should we go back to the scenario of before, meaning a very strong centralized government, or do we go with something else? They choose to go with the model, the example of Canada, to implement a federalism. But then there is also other problems, because since 30 years, Somalia has been also a playground of many mafia groups, terrorist groups, and many other interest groups who were doing a lot of illegal activities, be it illegal charcoal, destroying all the forests in Somalia and then selling the charcoal to the Gulf country, or wildlife traffic, but also many other things. So now that the government is coming and trying to at least not only to establish this federal system, but to fight these terrorist group and these mafia groups, a lot of other groups are attacking them. So and the COVID pandemic is adding another layer of challenge. I would like to, with Djibouti. Djibouti have never been a democratic society since the independence. Since 43 years, Djibouti has been a dictatorship. For 22 years, it was one guy, and then before he left, he gave it to his nephew. And now this guy is actually, he's in 4th term into power. and the total control you cannot imagine. And the worst thing is actually all these military bases are somehow playing into the hand of the dictatorship in Djibouti. Because since Somalia was not safe, Djibouti was kind of the safe place to have their military base, but then also to the geostrategic importance of the Arabic and Gulf Strait, where you have all the oils going on, as well as all the international maritime lines going through the Bab al-Mandab. So they prefer actually to deal with a dictatorship system rather than actually respect what they try to implement in their own country. I'm talking about Western countries who are actually paying huge money, and this money are going to the pocket of this regime, these dictatorial regimes, who repressing the people. The people of Djibouti, the other problem they are facing is the only country within the Horn whose speaking language or communication language is French. All the other countries, the communication language is English, so they can understand each other. They can at least build some kind of learning or experience learning or other things. But in Djibouti, the major barrier has been linguistic because they speak French. And then it's a small country, so it's easy to control. So what's happening, what's going on there, it's actually the diaspora. The people who left, who had enough chance to leave the country for their own security, are now the people who are trying to lead the change in Djibouti. And for example, I would like to mention a movement, because women are really doing amazing work when it comes to the Horn countries. It was a lady who started 2 years ago with a radio emission just from London. She started this radio emission. It's called Radio Bukao. And then and then people are trying to give her a whistleblower. There is a lot of Djiboutians who are playing whistleblower. They give all the corruption cases, and then she come with proof. So it created an aware raising within the population. What's happening is actually now the government understands that the people are no more neither actually afraid or into the confusion state of mind. So what's happening is actually the government is now using totally the COVID pandemic to really show his oppressive system. And that's why when I was mentioning now in the major city, in the capital city, you have checkpoint, and you can see within the capital, the army, I'm not talking about the police, the army, as well as the huge tanks within the cities, protecting the most important part of the city where government elite are living, but taking no care about the people living, their foods, or any help for the people. No, it's just actually how to make sure that this regime will continue to stand and continue to keep the power. So these are the challenge facing the social movement, totally different in the three countries, but the pandemic, the COVID pandemic, just added another layer of complication.
Thank you, Abdulrahman, for sharing. I feel you're the one, because you're speaking about 3 different countries, you're the one, I would say, I'm losing my English. Anyway, so sorry for asking you to speak about 3 countries. This is what I want to say. John, yeah, I would say it's the same question, you know, about the social movements and fighting against those in powers. What were the demands before the pandemic, and how are these demands met today?
Thank you very much, Emma. So I will want to see Kenya from a different perspective, because it's in the region, is one of the stable countries, and so it's grappling from power and different things at a very high level. So just before the pandemic, Kenya was struggling in different ways. One of the major struggles in this country is that the president and teams and social movements really pushing the government to make sure that corruption is, stopped. And there was quite a nice momentum growing from government to actually try to weed out some of those corruption deals that are happening in government that are amassing a lot of wealth and keeping it to a few people. So there were a lot of cases that were taken to court and that were being tried. And you know, when the COVID situation came, it's all quiet now. The other thing that was a big pressure now, which I think was more government, but I think it really the COVID situation gives the government, you know, even a better position, is that the government was pushing to change legislation, to change the constitution, because they want to, you know, put in place a different form of government, which again, a lot of the social movements were pushing to say, hey, you know, do we really need this? Or is just another layering, another way of, you know, siphoning public funds by creating different, you know, layers of power that are all going to be demanding and, you know, usurping the money, the taxpayers' resources to salaries, to dispositions, and big offices and all that, rather than pushing that money to the local situation. So of course there was a lot of dialogue that was happening, but of course because of the pandemic, there's no more meetings, and you know, all that is shut. And I think it's only to the government advantage, because finally, with such a poor population, if you know, you stay for a long time without food, and then finally the economy opens, and government want to change, you know, constitution, and now with the power of money that they have, because it doesn't mean that with the economy, you know, shutting down slowly, it does not mean that government necessarily does not have money. Yeah, so whatever money that they have, they will bring it out, and at that moment everybody is like really struggling to find a little bit of money to survive. And if government start to dish out money in different ways, they could buy the population and be able to actually get away with the changing of the legislation to suit, you know, their political interest. So I think, yes, I see that there was a good, you know, public pressure and all that, trying to direct, even if we're going to change the constitution, what was it that we're going to change? But with the situation of COVID weakening the population much more, I think it's not giving us a better grip on things. And of course, a lot of the social movements are also dependent on a lot of resources from outside. But, you know, because this is a global pandemic, there is no country that is actually now looking outside. Every country is trying to look at its own population. So we are also, you know, losing that, because the power of the social movement is also with the resources that are coming from outside to support them to continue to grow with the pressures to engage government. But without resources, how will they engage government? You know, the power has been taken away from people. So I think the COVID situation has really taken the social movement pressures to engage government a little bit back to a couple of years in things that were, you know, were progressing forward. Of course, we only, a lot of people are very happy, of course, with not really because of themselves, but looking at it from the political situation where, as Abdurrahman said, a lot of our politicians, because they have the money, for them, they have never actually cared to develop, you know, the local health institutions. But today, I mean, that is the place, because when you are sick, you can only be quarantined in your place. So therefore, you want to go to facilities that are good, because otherwise you're going to be really depressed. And a couple of our leaders have had to be quarantined. So they have come, you know, face to face with the reality of what some of those facilities are looking like. And therefore, we can only hope that going forward, the leadership is going to start to focus in developing, you know, facilities back at home, because that is what they have.
Thank you, John. I think we've reached our final question, and then we'll take some questions from the folks tuning in. Yeah.
I would like just to add something concerning Kenya. Yes, it's true, Kenya, it's one of the most stable countries when it comes to Horn countries. And Kenya actually has been facing a lot of pressure with the collapse of the Somali government during the last 30 years. At the same time, Kenya actually did a lot of things when it comes to the Somali people, because the biggest refugee camp is located in Kenya, Dadaab. as well as actually a huge Somali community who are living within the capital in Nairobi. So what's going on also before the pandemic, but it's now getting worsened by the pandemic. It's actually there are other foreign interests who are trying to play the two countries against each other, and they're trying actually to create some kind of conflict within these two brotherly countries. So I think within the social movement, when it comes to Somalia as well as in Kenya, they know these foreign powers who are trying to looking only their interests, be it terrorism or be it wildlife trafficking or other. But as my brother Kamanga mentioned, now the pandemic COVID actually worsened the already weak resource that this social movement used to have, and they building these bridges, and this is also another reality that we have to take into account.
Thank you, Abdirrahman. I don't know, John, if you want to, yeah.
Yeah, thanks. I think something that was not mentioned that I think is important to mention, and Abdirrahman have mentioned between, now the relationship between different border countries. Of course, both Somalia and Tanzania having Kenya having closed the borders in the last week is really creating a lot of heat locally, because particularly for Tanzania, again, there has been a lot of continued building of a relationship in the East African community. But the COVID situation is probably going to weaken that a lot more, because when Kenya closed the border 2 days ago, the president of Tanzania reacted very angrily to that situation. While Kenya closed the border but allowed for transportation of cargo across the border, but Tanzania just said no. I mean, if the relationship is not good, so it goes back to already a relationship that was not very good, but the momentum was being built. I think it's the same with Somalia, because again, Kenya has been very pivotal in terms of trying to support that country come back. But then with the closing of the border, will that then start to sour the relationship again? And what that relationship that have been built for many years, if it tilts because of this, then it will take us a lot more time to actually again try to rebuild that relationship. So those are issues that are now coming, which were not necessarily foreseen while this is happening. But it's unfortunate, because it looks like also our leadership from the AU perspective are also not talking amongst themselves, so that they know how do we buffer against the pressures and the economic backlash that's going to come as a result of this. So it's unfortunate. A lot of the instruments that we have that are supposed to guide the region are not seen. I have not seen anything being said by the African Union talking about, or the East African community talking about the COVID reality, and how do we, as countries that are living in the same kind of situation and having trade ties that are very close and very dependent on each other, whether that is the ports, whether that is the railways, all that infrastructure that was being developed. Now what if we start to fight amongst ourselves? It will take us another many years, 50 years, another 100 years to rebuild those relationships and get our economy to bounce back.
Thank you, John. I think it's a really good overview, I would say, of how the pandemic is like highlighting how it's not just affecting like social movements within countries, but also across borders, these relationships that were being cultivated, and how that is being impacted and will be impacted in the future. So let's take it back to a like micro level, and I'll ask maybe Duha, to respond to the kinds of or forms of solidarity that have been developed or put in place by the population in the context of the pandemic. I know you spoke a bit about like detaining activists, so I'm assuming there is something being done, or so yeah, if you could share more about that with us.
Sure. I think I'd like to just say that, like, beyond this sort of doomsday Africa being, you know, a passive victim narrative that's always pushed by Western media, it's always very important to also talk about the power of people and how people continue to organize and continue to take care of each other, despite their governments failing them, despite, you know, other parts of the world failing them and so on. But people locally are still strong. People locally are still doing a lot of the work and taking a lot of the burden of taking care of each other. One very good example that I always like to talk about is the neighborhood resistance committees. These are committees that were formed locally during the revolution, and they were basically just youth in different neighborhoods coming together, organizing their neighborhoods for political action at the time. So the neighborhood resistance committees are still there. They're continuing to work in their neighborhoods and to organize. But right now they're kind of shifting their work more towards the COVID-19 pandemic relief. So they're taking a lot of the work of supporting their neighborhoods with things like distributing bread, for example. And in some neighborhoods, they're actually delivering bread to people's houses. They're taking the work of the whole cooking gas situation of distributing it and getting it filled and so on. They're holding a lot of awareness campaigns. They're sterilizing high exposure areas. They're sterilizing markets. They got hold with health professionals on how to make antiseptics, and they're producing antiseptics by themselves and sort of giving it out in neighborhoods. Making face masks and distributing it in different places, because of course, like at the surge of this, the prices for face masks and hand sanitizers have just gone completely skyrocketed. People can't afford to buy them, so it's very important that this work is happening at the same time. There's a lot of youth that are volunteering in isolation centers and in hospitals, as there's a big shortage in health professionals, as I was talking about. There's youth that are volunteering in the call center for the Ministry of Health. And also always like the diaspora is always playing a very, very important role since the revolution and even before that. There's a lot of fundraising campaigns locally and mostly from the diaspora that are basically raising a lot of money right now to buy protective equipment, to buy hand sanitizer, to send these products to Sudan as well. In terms of the detention, I know that there are still some people who are protesting, but on a social distance, with keeping the distance apart between each other. But other than that, I don't think that I'm aware of any other sort of action on that side. One thing to note though is that NCP, like the former regime, al-Bashir's regime, people have been protesting throughout this pandemic. They continue to protest for those who are right now in jail, the president and all the leaders that are in jail right now. So their families continue to be protesting. And also, I think one very important thing that we forget when we talk about solidarity is the role of women in the household. That is an integral part of solidarity, I believe. Women perform almost all the household chores. And given right now that everybody's at home, there's a big burden on them, and they're taking that. A lot of women, I'm sorry to say for the men in Sudan, but women in Sudan, they do almost all the household jobs. It's not considered a job. It's not considered a solidarity. It's just considered as their job, their naturally given job. But that is I think that's a very big solidarity thing that we should mention.
Thank you, Daha. I agree totally. Yeah, but I think it's really inspiring, what you said about like how people are organizing to take care of each other, if there is no alternative from up there, from the government. Maybe let's pass. Yes.
And I just want to also note that there's also a lot of people who are taking basically taking in families and making sure that the number of these families are getting fed these days. So there's people who are taking care of income for several families at the time. And that's also like a very, very important solidarity that's happening.
Thank you. So yeah, maybe I'll ask John to share with us, the forms of solidarity that have been put in place by the population in Kenya in response to the pandemic. John, you're muted. Yes.
So we've seen a lot of the civil society organizations and movements putting packages together, going back to either their partners and getting a lot of equipment and sanitizers to the local communities, and a lot of awareness raising about what they should or should not do, so that they can take care of themselves. I've also seen that in this country, in some of the rural areas, as I said, I've mentioned that tourism is a big income for Kenya, and that was cut off, and a lot of the works, then a lot of the tourism income in the rural communities goes to support a lot of the conservation work that is happening. So a lot of our rangers who say protect wildlife were now in a very vulnerable position, because without the tourism revenues, it means that a lot of people will lose employment, and that means that our wildlife it's insecure. And so a lot of those civil society groups that are working in conservation coming together to then either reach out to the government, to push the government to say, can we also get an allocation from the COVID monies to see whether we can make sure that we can continue to pay salaries of the different people who are protecting wildlife, and also making sure that the teams that are working in those wildlife areas are also seen to be essential service providers. Because normally, I mean, essential service providers, is a nurse, is a military guy, those kind of groups. But we are forgetting that a lot of our heritage, if we don't take care of it during this time, of course, there's a lot of opportunistic situation here for people poaching and all that. And then by the time we come out of this situation, again, the momentum, the energy, the effort that has been put in place to secure our wildlife will have really been taken away. So there's quite a little bit of that. The transport industry, again, because a lot of the rural areas, a lot of the areas far away from the centers that supply food, now with transport being an impediment, what is happening? So a lot of people now in different centers, in rural areas, will then get together and then be able to kind of track goods jointly for their families and for their supplies. So there's a little bit of people then coming together to even support themselves, where it would have normally been not the case.
Thank you, John. So finally, I'll pass the question to Abdulrahman. Again, if you could share the forms of solidarity being put in place in Djibouti, Somalia, and Ethiopia.
Thank you, Emma. Just maybe before that, let me put for the benefits of the people who are listening to us, that when we're talking about the Horn region, you have on the two extremity, you have Kenya and Sudan, and then in between you have Ethiopia, Somalia, Djibouti, and we didn't talk about Eritrea, one of the most closet hermetic regime like North Korea in the north in the Horn region. So Sudan has an amazing and long history when it comes to social movement and struggle. When we look at the history, Sudan is one of the first country in the African continent who had unions workers, political parties, and even if I remember, I think it's the first communist party the first actually, even before some European countries. And then you have Kenya, who had like an amazing experience within the Commonwealth, and then who actually developed also some, especially when it comes to the social movement or social fabric. For example, during some of my traveling there, I was really amazed by how the people, they already know, like you are in England or in Europe, they know how already to organize themselves, how to lobby the government, how to actually deal with media, how to prepare their case and then bring it together, and then how to fundraise actually when it comes in terms of resource and all that. So when it comes in the in-between, I think Ethiopia, Somalia, Djibouti, we have a lot to learn from our two country brothers, Sudan as well as Kenya. And the latest events in Sudan actually was amazing. How they actually, the nonviolent revolution, the people led by the people, especially the youths, the women, as well as the unions workers, and how they come together and then how they put down a 30 years old, very, very ferocious dictatorship. Then it was Ethiopia. So yes, we can learn a lot. Maybe something that Somalia can bring in this basket of knowledge sharing in terms of solidarity, it's actually the role of the diaspora. When you look at the last 30 years, when the country was destroyed, and then a lot of Somali people were actually around the globe, they developed one of the most dynamic diaspora. And then they created even an amazing system that make today Somalia, a country actually coming back of 30 years of civil war, one of the country actually using a paperless money system, an electronic money. And this is actually helping. It has a huge impact when it comes to the field, especially people who are living in the in rural area. Then by the click of your mobile, just sending money to help, and then to get the information and help and all that. So all of this can be different form of solidarity. Let me just then talk about Djibouti. Small country, one of the most strategic within the Horn, very small, but at the same time very strategic because of the geolocation. And then you have all this military base, but at the same time, yes, there also in Djibouti, it's the youth who are leading the demand for a change, for democratic change. But I mentioned they're facing, in one hand, they're facing a very, very strong dictatorial regime with a huge security apparatus controlling the internet, the life, the people. And then this regime is actually using the living condition as a mean to get the approbation of its citizen. So meaning that the day you start criticizing even indirectly that regime, they have the mean to cut your living condition, your wage, everything. They block your bank account. For example, when I went back to Djibouti and then I created this environmentally social business, I started actually building cooperative based on the model in Quebec. Immediately the government saw that as a threat. And then when faced with threat, then I had to leave for my own security. And that's the reason I am actually staying in Somalia. But the movement, the social movement is led by youth. And especially I would like to mention a group of youth who are doing an amazing work, the Djiboutian patriotic movement, who are really playing one of the biggest role. Not only at the same time bringing the diaspora, but at the same time trying to organize the youth, the women, bringing the different political party for one case, saying let us stop playing the regime game, who's using tribalism, because we didn't mention about that. All these countries in the Horn, you have different ethnic living. So whenever the regime in place feel threatened, they use the tribalism card to divide and rule. So that's why this Djiboutian patriotic movement led by youth, when they came together and doing an amazing work. For example, one of the things they're doing today is actually to bring all these regime people, they know that at one moment it will end. It cannot continue eternally like this case. So what's going on? They are trying to bring all their money into a safe place. They cannot go to Europe like they used to go like 20 years ago. Now they are going to North America. I mentioned one thing, in Djibouti people speak French. The only place French is speaking in North America is in Quebec. So now you have all the people of the regime who are buying huge villas and with money stolen in Quebec. So the kind of difference of solidarity we can build, for example, with the Convergence, the Luttes in Quebec and in Canada, and especially with alternative, it's actually to get in line with this patriotic movement of youth in Djibouti, so we can raise or bring legal or judicial cases into the court, because these are bien mal acquis in French, what they call it's. These are things that was belonging to the public that was stolen. So how to bring back also, but more importantly, when this kind of regime, when they feel threatened at any way, then yes, we can have another card actually. So we can have a small place where we can push for more reform. After saying this, I would like to mention first thing. I think the first thing is actually how between us, the South, and in this case within the Horn, how we can build more solidarity. Because in the case of Djibouti or in the case of Somalia, we can learn a lot what happened in Sudan, what happened in Ethiopia, as well as the amazing experience of the Kenyan civil as well as social movement.
Thank you, Abdirrahman, and thank you, all three of you. I really appreciate everything you shared. I think we have one question that was asked on Facebook. So I'm not sure who asked the question, but here it is. What can we as locals of these countries, or as locals of these countries, how could we continue earning our living through being protected? So I think it's this balance, between people being able to earn a living. Does anyone want to take a stab at this question? Yeah, John.
So I think there's a new reality that is coming to us. That for sure. I mean, before we used to, you have to go get an education, and because getting an education meant that you were going to be employed. But look, today we are all locked in our own countries. You can't go outside your country. You have to be home, and even when you are home, you can probably not get a place to be employed because businesses are closing. Yeah. So this is telling us a few things. One is that how do we take advantage of technological development today? Yeah, that we actually can be able to work from our home, and whether that is in America or wherever, you are seated in your home and you're able to use technology to be able to deliver goods, deliver services to different parts of the country without you being able to travel. Yeah, because the normal way we've done things, like you have to fly all the way, I don't know, to China, go get your wares, go to Dubai and bring it back home. But I think things are going to change, and there is the reality for us is that we also need to now move forward to start to understand how do we work well without necessarily being outside our home area, because technology is helping us. Today, we're able to have workshops, we're able to have webinars, we're able to communicate across the globe where everybody is sitting at the comfort of their houses. This was not the reality before. I think the other thing that is, again, important is that we need to start to think that, you don't have to get employed to be able to get your food. Yeah. So how do we start to make sure that as we are learning, as we are understanding things, how do we create localized industries? Because people have always looked, at the diaspora, for instance. So a lot of countries have depended on diaspora, people to go out there. Suppose you can't go out, what is going to happen? Yeah. So I think we are being pushed back to roots to start to understand how do we, going forward globally, be able to not necessarily be able to go out in containment. How do we develop our own places? The issue that will bring about health. How do we start to develop our own health facilities so that then you are sure when you go to the local hospital, the local clinic, you will actually get the services that you need. You don't have to burn fuel. You don't have. So I think there will be. It's interesting when the globe opens up again, because I think we will not travel as much as we used to. I think we will not be able to, burn a lot of fuel. What is that going to even do to our carbon footprint? Because if we are not traveling, if you're not using your car, people are going to actually start to save our planet. So we will probably be living in a better environment if we all kind of found new ways of working.
Thank you, John. Yeah, Abdelrahman.
Thank you, John. Very interesting. I would like just to add that yes, the pandemic COVID doesn't have actually all negativities. It has some positive element. As I mentioned before, I said actually it unmasked the corruption and the bad governance within the different regime in the home countries. But at the same time also, as my colleague and brother mentioned, it has to make us think, especially when I'm talking the social movement within this country, to rethink our priority. Most of the countries who have resource, natural resource, what they do until today is actually they just export this resource that they have, just raw resource have been exported. But today with the containment and the lockdown, it's actually, hey, where are you gonna get your food? Where are you gonna get the service? So it's bringing back, and an important element, it's actually agriculture. Agriculture, it's an important element when it comes to Africa, and especially when it comes to this region, Sudan, Ethiopia, Kenya. It's very, very, and Somalia in lesser case, because Somalia is actually the most important element is actually livestock. But now people are also developing micro farm and agro-pastoralism. So agriculture have been under huge threat the last couple of years. And we were fighting that. I remember with my colleague, John Kamanga, we were fighting within this regional environmental network against the American big multinational who were trying to privatize the small farm into huge, like the model in the US, and then bring genetically modified seed and all these things. So that's why I'm saying this pandemic is also actually has some positive element, because it has to force us to rethink our priority. But again, like my brother said, where are our leaders within the African unions? Where are they? Are they just continuing taking just per diem and continuing to sleeping and going conference to another conference with a continuous blah blah without any concrete action, without waiting that? I think it's the responsibility of the social movement to take that action. And then when the youths who are coming from the university, because today, even before the COVID, when the students come from the university, we didn't have any opportunity to give them any job. But if we focus on our resource, be it at the agricultural level or other resource, yes, we can develop huge opportunities for our youth. And then we can develop the research, we can develop this capacity in terms of research and development within this country, not always depending on other country. And I would like just to conclude with one remark. Actually, we mentioned China. China is a huge and amazing country. There is a lot of good and maybe some bad things also. But there is a proverb within the Chinese that I used to use when I was in Quebec, and I used to use that with other colleagues when we used to mobilize or trying to raise awareness within the different movement. It's in French. That proverb, it says, Comprendre, c'est l'action avant l'action. To understand is the action before the action. This is our problem today in these countries, because the regime we are facing, the first thing they actually took out from us is actually the comprehension of how the reality we are living in. And then they gave us their narrative. So one of the first things that social movement is doing in this country is actually to fight that narrative and then to bring back the reality. That's why what my brother mentioned, John, the new technology are very important. And all the youths and the majority of the social movement are using this new technology today to spearhead their fight and their justifiable demand for more freedom and more democracy within this country.
Thank you, Abdulrahman. I don't know, Duha, if you want to add anything.
Yeah, I think Abdulrahman and John pretty much summed up everything very accurately. I do want to note that one thing with technology and internet is that there is also, again, a very big divide in terms of who has access to internet and who doesn't. There's majority of the population in Sudan, for example, does not have access to internet or these technologies that we're talking about to use. So there's definitely other alternatives to that on a local level. So technology is good, but it's not everyone has access to it. And another thing I think is really important in this time is this sort of making us all self-examine our privileges and what we have access to and what we don't. This is a very good time for so many people to just look back at the privileges that they're able to have in their areas, which others are not able to have because of ethnic backgrounds or social backgrounds and so on. We hear a lot these days that people are saying, you know, when things go back to normal, when things go back to normal. I think it's also like normal wasn't good. And we saw that in this pandemic. Normal had a lot of inequalities. Normal had a lot of insecurities. Normal didn't have peace in the world. And so I think this is an important point for us to think about, not going back to normal, but rather changing our realities and really challenging the social systems and the political systems that are in place that have made that normal become really bad. I think this is the time for that.
Thank you, Duha. We have one more question for Abdulrahman. In Somalia, we have our schools and universities closed, and it looks like the world isn't getting the vaccine that fast. So how could we overcome this obstacle and continue our journey of future building? Oh, well, I think it's a question for all the panelists, but Abdulrahman, you've been speaking about Somalia, so yeah.
Yes, actually, I have been interacting with university students here in Somalia, and I invited them actually to follow this panel. So yes, my brother John mentioned actually with the lockdown, it's created a huge problem for the whole society in each country. But the Somalia case, it's actually specific. It's actually adding to a disastrous situation, very, very difficult, dramatic situation. It make it even worse. As I said, actually, the government is not playing its role. So most of the university are run, let's say, supported by private sector, supported by the diaspora. And then you can see that a lot of people in Somalia, especially mother or the father, they will really try to save a little money so that at least one of their kids will go or make it to the university. And then the pandemic happened. And then everything is actually closed. Everything has been stopped. So it just created. And for example, yesterday I had a meeting with this student and I couldn't answer actually that question for them, for example, how they can continue. Some of the university, for example, they start putting online classes. But my sister Duha mentioned, not everyone has neither the meaning, neither even the money to buy some data to get internet so that they can follow their online classes. So I don't know how to answer that question, but it was important actually to bring this. The tragedies are multiple, and it's really difficult at some level, especially me being here in the field and seeing the people where there is no a formalized government yet, and then where the biggest support of the people, it's the diaspora, but everything has been stopped, and then the already difficult realities becoming just worse and more dramatic. I don't have an answer.
Well, thank you for sharing, Abdurrahman. I think you answered like thoroughly, even though we don't have an answer, which is right. But yeah, I don't know if any one of you wants to add like some final thoughts. I don't think we have any more questions from anyone. So if any one of you wants to share maybe some closing remarks or final thoughts, word even that comes to mind before we end this conversation. And I'll let you, yes, Abdurrahman.
Maybe Emma, if you can just tell us about the Convergence, the platform of the Convergence of the Global South struggles. And then the idea is actually how we can link with the different social movements who are struggling to bring change, positive change in each country here in the Horn countries, how we can link them with other movements in other countries, and then how we can establish learning experience, case studies, knowledge, and then maybe strengthen the different solidarity of the different social movement within the Horn. Thank you.
Thank you, Abdurrahman. So I think Safa would be more suited to answer this question, but I would say from personal, I would say reflections or engagement from the peripheries, I really think even these conversations, these series of conversations that have been hosted over the last few weeks is, and you know, guests like you who are, all three of you, you know, who are, allow us, you know, to engage critically, I would say, with thinking that emerges directly from social movements, in addition to the challenges of solidarity, you know, in terms of class, education, gender, ethnicities, countries. So all these nuances that are usually, I would say, just flattened and, or like people either highlight the differences or the similarities, while conversations like these really allow us to engage, I would say critically, you know, with different realities. And then this, I believe personally, would open up, you know, such conversations or sharing of experiences allows us, like it opens up new possibilities or allows us to create or recreate new narratives, you know, for envisioning different alternatives. But I know that Safa is like, is here, but muted. Maybe if she wants to share something more in specific in terms of Convergence des Luttes de Suds. Yeah.
I want especially to thank everybody who participate to this discussion. I learned a lot about what's happening there, and thank you so much.
Okay. Yes, John.
So mine is an interesting observation, because yes, it's important that we continue to learn amongst ourselves, but really it's important then that we start to also challenge ourselves in Africa to say, you know, let's start to get homegrown solutions for a lot of what ails Africa, because you know, the more we depend on the West, the more we depend on China, that even on things that are initially coming from China, now China is coming back to support us to kind of, you know, resolve the problem. It's a tragedy, really. I think it's about time that we also got up and we have all these learning institutions, we have research institutions, we have what it takes. We have the technology back home. Some of the innovations that we have done in the last couple of years is good. The West is also learning from Africa. So I think it is important that we start to, again, as a social movement, to try and push our leadership to say we need to invest in what we need to ensure that we are actually creating the environment and creating, you know, the framework, the infrastructure that we require to be able to make ourselves self-sufficient. Because until we get there, we will always be in this weak position where, because of the economic power, and we will also learn from different countries what happens in the next phase. So after COVID, every country will be trying to swing back into, you know, a vibrant economy. What will that take? Yeah, where are our economists? Where are the economists in Africa? Can we bring them to this platform to start to say, hey, what routes should Africa take to be able to bounce back and get back into economic power? So I think we need more and more of these platforms so that we can continue to engage, we learn with each other, but we also get to give pressure where necessary so that we can, you know, get to where we want as different nations. Thank you.
Yeah, I just want to say, I just also want to add a little bit about Convergence de Sud. I'm one of the members also of the Convergence, and basically it's the idea is that it's a collective for people coming from different parts of the world, mainly the global south, to sort of come together in solidarity to bring attention to situations in the global south, and also not only how people in the diaspora can help, but also how for example, the Canadian government is complicit in a lot of the things that are happening in the global south. And this is also important to inform the public here that that your governments have a lot to do with this, and what is your role in it. And also connecting between struggles of different social movements, notably the indigenous community here in Turtle Island, in Tiohtià:ke, Montreal, and also different indigenous struggles around the world, connecting it again with issues in like the MENA sector together, connecting issues of Africa with like the struggle in Palestine, for example. So we've done one public sort of event where we had speakers from different parts of the world, from Cuba, from Haiti, Sudan, Lebanon, and so on, and each spoke about the context of the situation in each countries right now with the uprisings happening. And then we were supposed to have a massive march that was in March, actually planned in March, but we couldn't do it because of the pandemic. But yeah, right now, so most of the things are being held online. One of them is this webinar series that's also with in partnership with Alternatives. I think that's it for Convergence.
Thank you, Doha. Yes, Abdelrahman, do you want to add something?
Yes, I would like just to add that I agree with my brother John that we don't have to wait. We have been waiting for so long, and we only get problems, not solution. So solution will come from the African people for their own problems, and I believe strongly in that. And then we can already start. Actually, we already started. Actually, we didn't wait for this discussion. There is already different social movement who are already consulting each other and sharing information and all that. For example, in one case at the environmental level or climate change level. But then we can improve that and then bring, for example, at the labor level, what is the situation of the labor in this country? We talk about China. Yes, for example, China is looking the Horn country today as a major swap shops They created a huge factories in Ethiopia, and I believe also in Kenya, adapting the country, where people actually are gaining less than $1 per month, working more than 12 hours there. So yes, we can learn, for example, in that case, the huge experience of the Sudanese labor unions. We can learn from the Kenyan innovation and creativity when it comes to homegrown solution. As I said, I'm always amazed when I go there. For example, they created their own stove to solve some of the problem in terms of deforestation. They created locally made solution by who are then making their own social business from there on how to solve some of the water or waste problems. So yes, we can learn from each other, and definitely it's a must that to already create these links between the South. And then the role, what I see the role of the platform of the Convergence, it's as a resonance, in caisse de résonance, as they say it in France, or actually trying to bring at a global level the struggles of this social movement, their win, their loss, the oppression they're facing, and then to be in solidarity. We are not asking you actually to come here and take our place. No, we are here. We're going to be in the front lines to solve some of the most pressing problems we are facing, but to be with us in solidarity, so you can voice also, to be, if I can say, our voice there, and bring our voice as well as our struggles going on here. Thank you.
Thank you, Abdulrahman. I think on this note, we will end this discussion. We're I think, a few minutes over time. So again, I would like to thank all three of you really for sharing with us, for your generosity, and for, at least on a personal level, for educating me. And I don't know, I hope to reconnect later. So have a good day, everyone. Thank you so much, and thank you, Safa, also, Al-Jundi al-Majhoul, for helping from behind the scenes.
Thank you.
Okay. Safa is, as always, Jundi working behind the scenes, making magic happen all the time.
Thank you so much for all of you.
Okay.
Thanks, everyone.